8 pairs of desperate eyes stared through the blizzard at the lone farmhouse, knowing this was their last chance before the cold claimed them all. The oldest girl, Ruby May, clutched a shivering 6-year-old to her chest, while 7 other children huddled behind her like scared rabbits. They'd been running for 3 days, and the youngest ones were barely conscious from hunger and cold inside the weathered farmhouse. Thaddeus Mercer sat motionless at his kitchen table, staring at the untouched plate of beans he'd heated for supper. The 45-year-old farmer's calloused hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. His hollow eyes reflected the flickering candlelight, showing a man who'd given up on everything except breathing. The wind howled through the gaps in the wooden walls, but Thad barely noticed anymore. Nothing much bothered him. These days, 2 years had passed since cholera swept through their small settlement like the angel of death. 2 years since he'd buried his wife, Margaret, and their twin boys, Samuel and Joshua, in the frozen ground behind the house. 2 years of talking to ghosts and eating meals for one. He'd kept the farm running out of habit, not hope. The cattle needed feeding, the fences needed mending, and the work kept his hands busy enough that his mind couldn't wander to that terrible week when fever took everything that mattered. A sharp knock echoed through the silence. Thad's head snapped up, his brow furrowing. Nobody traveled these parts after dark, especially not in weather like this. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles east, and the town of Copper Ridge was a full day's ride south. He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the wooden floor, and moved toward the door with cautious steps. Another knock, more urgent this time, then a voice, high and desperate, cutting through the wind. "Please, mister, we're freezing out here." That paused with his hand on the door latch. The voice belonged to a young girl, maybe 15 or 16 years old. His jaw tightened as he thought about Margaret, how she'd never turned away a soul in need. But that was before everything went to hell and left him with nothing but bitter memories and empty rooms. "We got little ones with us," the voice called again, trembling with cold and fear. "Please, sir, just for the night." Through the small window beside the door, Thad caught a glimpse of movement in the swirling snow. Dark shapes huddled together, too many to count in the blizzard. His hand remained frozen on the latch as his mind raced. Strangers meant complications. Strangers meant questions he didn't want to answer and conversations he didn't want to have, but little ones meant something else. Entirely against his better judgment, Thad pulled the door open. The wind immediately tried to tear it from his grip, and snow whipped into his face like tiny daggers. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. 8 children stood on his porch, ranging from what looked like 6 years old to maybe 15. They were soaked through, shivering uncontrollably and clinging to each other for warmth. The oldest girl had fierce green eyes and tangled auburn hair that hung in frozen strands around her face. She held the smallest child, a little girl who looked unconscious from exhaustion. "Thank God," Ruby May whispered, her lips blue with cold. "Mister, we've been walking for days. The little ones, they can't go no further." Thad's eyes moved over the group, taking in their torn clothes, their bare feet wrapped in rags, the hollow look of hunger in their faces. These weren't ordinary travelers, these were runaways, and from the looks of them, they'd been running hard and fast from something terrible. He should close the door. He should tell them to move along. Getting involved with runaway children would bring nothing but trouble, and he'd had enough trouble to last 10 lifetimes. But the smallest girl in Ruby May's arms reminded him of someone else, someone with dark curls and rosy cheeks who used to run to him when thunder frightened her in the night. The memory hit him like a physical blow, and before he could stop himself, he stepped aside. "Get in here before you freeze to death," he said gruffly, hating himself even as the words left his mouth. As the children stumbled into his warm kitchen, bringing with them the scent of fear and desperation, Thad had no idea that opening his door would set in motion events that would either save him or destroy him completely, because what Ruby May hadn't told him yet was why they were running, who was chasing them, and what those men would do to anyone who helped them escape. The children scattered around Thad's kitchen like frightened animals, finally finding shelter. Ruby May gently lowered the unconscious little girl onto the wooden bench near the stove, while the others huddled close to the warmth. Thad watched them with growing unease, noting details that made his stomach churn. Fresh bruises on thin arms, welts across one boy's back visible through his torn shirt. The way they all flinched when he moved too quickly. "What's your name, girl?" That asked. Ruby May, his voice rougher than he intended. Ruby May, Sir Ruby May Hollister. She kept her chin up despite her chattering teeth. This here's my sister Daisy. She nodded toward the unconscious child. And these are the others from where we came, and where exactly did you come from? Thad moved to his pantry, pulling out what little food he had: dried biscuits, some bacon, a jar of preserves Margaret had made before everything ended. Ruby May's eyes darted toward the door, then back to him. The riverside home for foundlings, sir. 3 days' ride north of here. Thad's hand stilled on the jar of preserves. He'd heard whispers about that place in town, an orphanage run by a man named Cornelius Wickham, who took in unwanted children and supposedly gave them homes and education, but the whispers also spoke of children who disappeared, of harsh discipline, of things that made grown men look away when the subject came up. You ran away. He said it wasn't a question. Yes, sir? Ruby May's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. We had to. The youngest boy, maybe 8 years old, suddenly spoke up they was going to sell. Daisy to that man with the gold teeth said she was pretty enough to fetch a good price, Ruby. May's face went white. Hush, Tommy, don't. It's true. Tommy's voice cracked with emotion, and they was going to do worse to the older girls. Mrs. Wickham said Ruby May was getting too mouthy, that she needed to learn her place before I said hush. Ruby May snapped, but her hands were shaking now, and not from the cold. Thad felt something cold and deadly settle in his chest. He'd suspected abuse, but this was something far worse: human trafficking, child slavery, the kind of evil that made a man's blood run cold and his fists clench. Without thinking, how long you been at that place, he asked. Quietly, 2 years for most of us, Ruby May replied. They took us from different towns when our families died or couldn't keep us no more, said they'd give us good homes, but she trailed off. But Dad could fill in the blanks. He'd seen enough of the world to know how these stories ended. Orphans disappeared into the shadows of civilization, used and discarded by people who saw children as commodities instead of human beings. They're coming after you. He said, another statement, not a question. Ruby May nodded miserably. Mr. Wickham don't let his property just walk away. He's got men who track runaways, mean men with guns and dogs. She looked directly at him then, her green eyes fierce. Despite her fear, you can't keep us, mister. They'll hurt you too if they find us here. Soon as the storm breaks, we'll move on. But even as she said it, little Daisy whimpered in her sleep, and Tommy started coughing, the kind of deep rattling cough that spoke of pneumonia setting in. The other children looked ready to collapse where they stood. Thad stared at them, his mind racing. He should feed them, let them rest until the storm passed, then send them on their way with supplies and directions to the nearest town. That was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But as he looked at Daisy's pale face and heard Tommy's worsening cough, he realized these children wouldn't last another day in the wilderness, and if Wickham's men caught them, the sound of hoofbeats echoed faintly through the storm, still distant but unmistakably heading in their direction. Ruby May's head snapped toward the window, her face draining of all color. They found us, she whispered. The hoofbeats grew louder, cutting through the wind like thunder. Ruby May grabbed Daisy and pulled her toward the back of the kitchen while the other children pressed themselves against the walls like they were trying to disappear into the wood itself. Their terror was so complete, so absolute, that it made Thad's chest tighten with a rage he hadn't felt since he'd buried his family. Get away from the windows, he ordered quietly, moving to blow out the candles. All of you into the back room now. But Ruby May shook her head frantically. No, mister, you don't understand. If they find us here, they'll say you stole us. Mr. Wickham's got papers, legal documents that say we belong to him until we're 18. The law's on his side. The law's got nothing to do with what I just heard, Thad replied grimly, checking the load in his rifle. Selling children ain't legal anywhere. Papers or no papers, you think that matters? Ruby May's voice cracked. Wickham's got judges in his pocket, sheriffs who look the other way. He's got money and connections, and we're just orphans nobody cares about. Through the darkened window, Thad could make out shapes moving in the snow. 3 riders, maybe 4, sitting their horses like men who'd done this before. They weren't rushing toward the house. They were taking their time, confident in their ability to handle one. Lone farmer, how do you know about this place? Thad asked Zul, watching the riders. Heard talk in town about a hermit farmer who minded his own business. Ruby May whispered, figured you might not ask too. Many questions might let us rest a night before moving on. The irony wasn't lost on That his reputation for being unfriendly, for wanting to be left alone, had actually drawn these children to his door. Margaret would have laughed at that. She'd always said his gruff exterior hid a good heart, even when he tried his hardest to prove her wrong. A sharp knock echoed through the house, different from the children's desperate plea earlier. This was the knock of men who expected to be answered, who weren't asking for anything but demanding it. Open up. The voice was deep, authoritative, with a hint of violence underneath. We're looking for some runaway children, tracking them. Let us hear that. Looked at the 8 young faces staring at him with a mixture of hope and terror in their eyes. He saw his own children, Samuel's curiosity, Joshua's mischievous grin, the way they'd looked at him like he could solve any problem, fight any monster. But he also saw Margaret's disappointment. If he turned these children over to men who would hurt them, she'd never forgiven cowardice, especially when it came to protecting the innocent. You got proof these children are on my property? Thud called. Through the door, his hand steady on his rifle, a different voice answered, colder and more refined. I am Silas Crane, representative of the Riverside Home for Foundlings. We have legal authority to recover our charges wherever they may be found. Open this door, or we'll be forced to search your property by other means. Ruby May's grip tightened on Daisy. That's him, she breathed. That's Wickham's enforcer. He's the one who she couldn't finish the sentence, but the way she instinctively moved to shield. The younger children told Thad everything he needed to know. I don't see any children here, Thad replied loudly, and I don't recall inviting you onto my land. The silence that followed was thick with menace. Then Crane spoke again, his voice carrying the promise of violence. We tracked them to your door, farmer. Their footprints are still visible in your snow. You've got exactly 1 minute to produce them, or we'll come in and take them ourselves. Tommy started to wheeze harder, his cough echoing in the tense silence. One of the older boys, maybe 12, had tears streaming down his face as he stared at the door like it was the gates of hell itself that found himself at a crossroads. He'd never wanted to face turn over 8 terrified children to men who would hurt them or make enemies of people with money, power, and legal authority. Either choice would have consequences, but only one would let him sleep at night. The problem was he'd stopped caring about sleeping peacefully a long time ago. 30 seconds, farmer. Crane's voice had taken on an edge of anticipation, like he was actually hoping for resistance that made his choice. He moved away from the door toward the children huddled in his kitchen. Ruby May, he said quietly, is there a back way out of that orphanage, somewhere they might not expect you to go? Her eyes widened with desperate hope. There's an old mine shaft about 5 miles east of here. It connects to caves that run for miles underground. But mister, you can't. Time's up. The door exploded inward as Crane's boot connected with the wood, and 3 armed men burst into Thad's kitchen like wolves into a henhouse. Silas Crane stepped through the shattered doorway like death itself had come calling, tall and lean, with pale eyes that seemed to enjoy other people's fear. He wore a black coat that made him look more like an undertaker than a child recovery agent. 2 other men flanked him, rough-looking types with the kind of scars that came from violence, not honest work. Well, Crane said softly, his gaze moving over the 8 children pressed against the kitchen walls. There they are, my lost little lambs. Thad kept his rifle trained on Crane's chest, though he knew the odds were against him. 3 armed men against 1, and children in the crossfire. But something in Crane's smile, cold and predatory, made Thad's decision easier. These children are under my protection now, Thad said evenly. You want them, you'll have to go through me. Crane actually laughed, a sound like glass breaking. Your protection, farmer. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I represent legitimate business interests. These children are property of the Riverside Home, legally bound to our care until they reach majority property. Thad's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Children ain't property. Oh, but they are. Crane pulled a folded document from his coat pocket, signed contracts, witnessed and notarized. Every one of these little ones agreed to indenture themselves to us in exchange for food, shelter, and education. Perfectly legal. Ruby May's voice shook with anger. We never signed nothing. You forged those papers after you took us the word of criminals against legal documentation. Crane shrugged. I wonder which a judge would believe. One of Crane's men, a barrel-chested brute with missing teeth, stepped forward. Enough talking, Silas. Let's just take them and get out of this cold. But Crane held up a hand, still studying Thad with those pale, calculating eyes. I'm curious about something, farmer. What makes a man who spent 2 years avoiding human contact suddenly decide to play hero for a bunch of runaway orphans? The question hit Dodd like a physical blow. How did Crane know about his isolation about the 2 years? Unless you've been watching me. Dodd realized this wasn't chance. You knew they'd come here. Crane's smile widened. The grieving hermit with a soft spot for children. Oh yes, we've had our eye on you for some time. Grief makes people predictable, you see, and useful. Ruby May's face went white. You led them here on purpose. You wanted us to find this place. Sometimes the fox needs to think it's found the perfect hiding spot. Crane said, makes the hunt so much more satisfying. Felt the trap closing around him like iron jaws. This whole thing had been orchestrated from the beginning, but why? What did Crane gain from involving him? Here's what's going to happen. Crane continued, his voice taking on a business-like tone. You're going to lower that rifle and step aside. We'll collect our property and be on our way in exchange. We'll forget you were ever involved, and if I refuse, then you'll be charged with kidnapping, harboring fugitives, and interfering with legal recovery of indentured servants. Your farm will be seized to pay damages, and you'll spend the rest of your life in territorial prison. Crane's eyes glittered with malice. Of course, accidents do happen to men who make themselves too much trouble. The threat hung in the air like poison. Thad could see the fear in the children's faces, but also something else. A desperate hope that someone finally would stand up for them. If you were, then what would you do? Risk everything to save 8 children you barely know, knowing it might get you all killed, or give them up to save yourself, knowing what horrible fate awaits them? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Dad decided next would determine whether these children lived free or died as slaves. You made one mistake, Crane, Dad said quietly, his finger tightening on the trigger. Oh, and what's that? You assumed I still had something left to lose. The rifle shot echoed through the kitchen like thunder, and Silas Crane's look of smug confidence vanished forever. But as his body hit the floor, the 2 remaining men drew their guns with deadly speed, and Dodd realized his gesture of defiance might have just signed all their death warrants. The kitchen exploded into chaos as Crane's men opened fire that dove behind his heavy wooden table, dragging Ruby May and little Daisy with him. As bullets splintered the walls above their heads, the other children scattered like startled deer, seeking whatever cover they could find in the small room. Get to the back room, Thad shouted over the gunfire, working the bolt on his rifle. Now, the barrel-chested man was advancing toward them, his pistol smoking in his hand, but he'd made the mistake of focusing on Dodd instead of watching his flanks. 12-year-old Moses Cartwright, one of the older boys, had grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the stove and brought it down on the man's skull with a sickening crack. The gunman dropped like a stone, but the third man, lean and quick as a snake, had already taken position by the door, cutting off their escape route. His cold eyes swept the room, calculating angles and cover. Professional in his violence. Enough, he barked. Drop the rifle, farmer, or I start shooting children. To prove his point, he swung his gun toward 10-year-old Beth, who was pressed against the wall with tears streaming down her face. His finger tightened on the trigger. That had no choice. He set his rifle on the floor and slowly stood up, hands raised. Smart man, the gunman said. Now we're going to walk out of here nice and easy. All of us. But as he spoke, Ruby May was already moving. She'd spotted something the gunman hadn't. Thad's hunting knife gleaming on the kitchen counter, just 3 feet away. With the desperate courage that only comes from having nothing left to lose, she lunged for it. The gunman spun toward her, but Thad was already in motion. 2 years of grief and rage exploded out of him as he tackled the man, both of them crashing into the wall with bone-jarring force. They fought like animals, rolling across the floor, each trying to gain control of the gun. The weapon went off again, the bullet burying itself in the ceiling, then again shattering the window and letting in a blast of freezing air that could feel his strength giving out. He was a farmer, not a fighter, and grief had made him weak. But then Ruby May was there, the hunting knife flashing down. The gunman screamed and released his grip on the pistol, clutching his wounded arm. Thad grabbed the weapon and rolled away, breathing hard. For a moment, the only sound was their labored breathing and the wind howling through the broken window. Then Tommy started coughing again, the sound wet and rattling in the sudden silence. We need to go, Ruby May said urgently. Crane said he was watching you, which means he probably told others where he was going. More men will come looking when these don't return. Thad looked around his kitchen, his sanctuary for 2 years. Now destroyed bullet holes in the walls, blood on the floor, the door hanging off its hinges. There was no going back from this. He'd killed a man, fought others, and made himself an enemy of people with resources and connections. The caves you mentioned, he said, checking the loads in the captured pistol. How far? 5 miles east, but it's rough country in this weather, Ruby May replied, and we got little ones who are already sick and weak. As if to emphasize her point, Daisy started crying, a weak mooing sound that spoke of fever and exhaustion. Beth was shivering uncontrollably. Despite being near the stove, and Tommy's breathing was getting worse by the minute. Thud made another impossible calculation: stay here and fight whoever came next, probably dying in the process, or venture into a blizzard with 8 sick children. Probably dying in the process. Either way, the odds were grim, but at least in the caves they'd have a chance. Everybody grab whatever warm clothes you can find, he ordered, moving toward his bedroom. Food, blankets, anything that'll keep you alive. We leave in 5 minutes. As the children scrambled to gather supplies, Thad stared down at Crane's body. The man's pale eyes were still open, still staring, but the arrogance was gone forever. In his coat pocket, the legal documents that supposedly made these children property were already soaking up blood. Ruby May appeared beside him, her young face hard with determination. You didn't have to do this for us, she said quietly. Now you're a fugitive, just like we are. Maybe, that replied, shouldering his rifle, but at least I'm a fugitive who can sleep at night outside. The storm was getting worse, and somewhere in the darkness more of Wicksham's men were probably already riding toward the isolated farmhouse. But as Thad looked at the 8 young faces depending on him for survival, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 years. Purpose. If you're enjoying this story so far, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will test everyone's will to survive, and you won't want to miss how this desperate escape unfolds. They had maybe 30 minutes before the next wave of hunters arrived. 8 lives hanging in the balance, and 5 meters of frozen hell between them and safety. What Thad didn't know was that their real troubles were just beginning. The frozen wasteland beyond Thad's farmhouse stretched endlessly in every direction, swallowing their footsteps as quickly as they made them. The wind cut through their borrowed coats like knives, and the snow was already knee-deep on the smaller children. Thad carried Daisy on his back, while Ruby May helped Tommy, whose coughing had gotten so bad he could barely walk. They'd been trudging through the blizzard for over an hour when they heard it, the distant sound of hoof-beats and men's voices. Growing closer by the minute. Down, Thad hissed, pushing the children behind a cluster of snow-covered boulders. Nobody moved, nobody breathed loud. Through the swirling snow they could make out the shapes of at least 6 riders moving in a search pattern across the landscape. These weren't the same men who'd come to the farmhouse. These were fresh hunters, probably sent when Crane failed to report back. Spread out, one of the riders shouted. They can't have gotten far in this weather. Little Beth started to whimper from the cold, and 13-year-old Marcus quickly put his hand over her mouth, his own face twisted with fear. They all knew what would happen if they were caught now. After what had happened at the farmhouse, there would be no mercy, no legal pretense, just bullets and shallow graves. The riders passed within 50 yards of their hiding spot, close enough that Thad could hear their horses breathing. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down the side of his face, pulled up near their boulder and studied the ground intently. Got tracks here, he called out. Fresh ones heading east. Thad's blood turned to ice in their desperation to get away from the farmhouse. He hadn't been careful enough about covering their trail. The snow was falling hard, but not hard enough to completely hide the footprints of 9 people. How many? Another rider asked, moving closer. Looks like all of them, plus 1 adult. The scarred man's voice carried a note of satisfaction. There may be an hour ahead of us, moving slow because of the kids. Good came the reply. Wickham wants them alive if possible, but he's offering a bonus for the farmer's head. Says the man needs to be made an example of. As the riders spurred their horses forward, following the trail east, Thad realized their situation had gone from desperate to hopeless. The men were mounted, moving faster than a group of exhausted children ever could, and worse, they were heading straight toward the caves that were supposed to be their sanctuary. We can't make it, Ruby May whispered, her lips blue with cold. They'll catch us before we reach the mineshaft. Thad looked at the 8 young faces surrounding him, all of them looking to him for answers. He didn't have. Tommy's breathing was getting worse. Little Daisy was burning with fever, and the others were showing signs of frostbite, despite their borrowed clothes. But as he watched the riders disappear into the snow, an idea began forming in his mind, a terrible, desperate idea that might save the children's lives at the cost of his own. Ruby May, he said quietly, you remember the way to those caves? Yes, sir. About 3 miles northeast from here, but take the others and keep going. Stay low, move quiet, and don't look back no matter what you hear. Her green eyes widened with understanding. No, mister, we ain't leaving you behind. You don't have a choice. Thad was already checking his weapons, counting ammunition. Those men are tracking us, which means someone needs to give them something else to track. Someone needs to lead them away from you. That's suicide, Marcus said, his young voice cracking. There's 6 of them, and only one of you. Maybe that replied. But I've got something. They don't nothing left to lose. He handed Ruby May his remaining food supplies and most of his ammunition. Get these children to safety. Find people who will help them start new lives somewhere far from here. Promise me. Tears were freezing on Ruby May's cheeks. I promise. But mister, what's your name? Your real name? Thaddeus Mercer. And I had 2 boys once about the same age as Tommy and Marcus. Here their names were Samuel and Joshua. The weight of that revelation hung in the frozen air. This wasn't just about saving 8 orphans anymore. This was about a broken man trying to honor the memory of the children he'd failed to save. Tell them about me sometimes, Thad said, rising to his feet. Tell them about the farmer who chose to fight. Before any of the children could protest further, he was moving away from them, deliberately leaving obvious tracks in the snow that led southwest, away from the caves, away from safety, away from any hope of survival. Behind him, he could hear Ruby May gathering the others, her voice strong despite her tears. Come on, everybody, we got to move now. As Thad disappeared into the blizzard, making as much noise as possible to draw the hunters' attention, he thought about Margaret and the boys waiting for him somewhere beyond the cold and pain. For the first time in 2 years, he was going to see them again, but first he had 8 young lives to save. Thad's plan worked better than he dared hope. Within 30 minutes, he could hear the hunters behind him, their horses' hooves thundering across the frozen ground as they followed his deliberately obvious trail he'd been breaking, branches kicking snow, even firing his rifle into the air, anything to make sure they focused on him instead of searching for the children. But now, as he crouched behind a fallen log with only 3 bullets left and 6 armed men closing in, Thad realized he might have been too successful. The hunters had spread out in a wide circle, cutting off every escape route. Their leader, the scarred man who'd found their tracks, sat his horse like a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. Give it up, farmer. The man called out, you're surrounded, outnumbered, and those kids are probably frozen to death by now anyway. Make this easy on yourself. Thad didn't answer. He was thinking about Ruby May and the others, hoping they'd reach the caves by now. In his mind, he could see them huddled together for warmth, maybe building a small fire to keep little Daisy alive, safe, free. I know you can hear me, the scarred man continued. Names. D. Morrison and I've been hunting runaways for 15 years, never lost a bounty yet, and I don't intend to start now. That's when Thad heard something that made his blood turn to ice, the sound of children crying carried on the wind from somewhere behind Morrison's position. Oh, did I mention? Morrison's voice took on a cruel edge. We found your little friends about an hour ago, holed up in some old mineshaft, sick as dogs and twice as helpless. No, it couldn't be true. Thad had given them enough of a head start, had drawn the hunters away from the caves. Unless you're lying, Thad called out, but his voice cracked with doubt. Morrison laughed. You want proof? Jenkins, bring one of them up here. A moment later, another rider appeared, and Thad's heart shattered like glass. There, tied to the saddle in front of Jenkins, was little Beth. Her face was stir with tears and her lips were blue with cold, but she was alive. We got all 8 of them, Morrison said, plus something extra. Seems like that Ruby May girl had some interesting things to say about what really goes on at the Riverside home. Real interesting to the kind of people who pay good money for that information. The full horror of the situation crashed over Thad like an avalanche. These men weren't just bounty hunters bringing back runaway orphans. They were part of something bigger, something darker. The children weren't going back to an orphanage. They were being sold to the highest bidder, and it was all his fault if he just turned them away from his door, if he'd minded his own Business like he had for 2 years they might have found somewhere else to hide. Instead, his attempt to save them had led them straight into the hands of monsters. Here's what's going to happen, Morrison continued. You're going to come out with your hands up, and we'll make your death quick, clean bullet to the head. Over and done, but if you keep playing hero, we'll make you watch what we do to these children before we put you down like a dog. To emphasize his point, Jenkins drew his knife and held it near Beth's throat. The little girl whimpered, her wide eyes searching the landscape for any sign of rescue that wasn't coming. Thud closed his eyes and thought about Margaret. What would she do? What would she tell him to do? The answer came to him with perfect clarity. Margaret had always said that some things were worth dying for, but more importantly, some things were worth living for, and sometimes the only way to save what mattered was to sacrifice everything else. All right, Thad called out, standing up slowly. I'm coming out. He stepped into the open hands, raised his rifle lying in the snow behind him. Morrison smiled with satisfaction, but Thad wasn't looking at him. He was looking at Beth, trying to communicate something with his eyes. Trust me, be ready. Smart choice. Farmer now walked toward me, slow and easy. Thad started forward, counting steps, 15 yards, 10-5, close enough to see the cruel satisfaction in Morrison's scarred face, close enough to smell the tobacco on his breath, close enough to grab the hunting knife from Morrison's belt and drive it deep into the man's leg before anyone could react. Morrison screamed and fell from his horse, blood spurting from the wound. In the confusion, Beth broke free from Jenkins and ran toward the trees. The other hunters were shouting, raising their weapons, but Thad was already moving. He rolled behind Morrison's horse as bullets winded overhead, then came up with the wounded man's pistol in his hand. One shot dropped Jenkins. A second sent another hunter diving for cover, but there were still 4 of them, and Thad was out in the open with nowhere to run. That's when he heard it, the sound of gunfire from the direction of the caves, followed by men screaming in pain and horses stampeding in panic. Ruby May's voice rang out across the frozen landscape, high and clear and fierce with determination. Nobody hurts our family. As chaos erupted around him, Thad realized the children hadn't been captured at all. They'd been waiting, watching, and when the moment was right, they'd struck back with the courage of lions. The hunters who thought they were collecting helpless prey had just discovered they were fighting a pack of wolves. The battle was over almost before it began. Ruby May and the older children had used the caves to their advantage, creating an ambush that caught Morrison's remaining men completely off guard. Marcus and Moses had rolled boulders down from the mine entrance, crushing 2 hunters beneath tons of rock. Ruby May herself had taken Morrison's rifle and proven she knew how to use it, putting bullets exactly where they needed to go. When the smoke cleared, only one of Wickham's men was still alive, and he was running toward the horizon as fast as his wounded horse could carry him. Thad found Ruby May standing over Morrison's body, the rifle still smoking in her hands. Her face was hard as granite, aged years in the span of hours. Behind her, the other children emerged from the caves like ghosts materializing from the darkness. How? Asked, struggling to understand what had just happened. We never went to the caves, Ruby May explained, her voice steady despite everything they'd been through. Soon as we heard them coming, I figured it was a trap, so we circled back, stayed downwind, and waited for the right moment. But Beth wasn't me, little Beth said, stepping out from behind a boulder with a grin on her face. That was Jenny. We're about the same size, and in this snow, Thad looked around and saw Jenny Wells, another of the orphans, waving from near the horses. She'd played the part of captured child, while the others set their trap. 8 children working together with the kind of coordination that only came from years of looking out for each other. We've been taking care of ourselves a long time before you came along, Mr. Ruby May said softly. But we never had anyone willing to die for us before that. That meant something. As they gathered the hunters' horses and supplies, that realized the children were right. They didn't need saving. They needed someone who believed in them, someone who saw them as family instead of property, someone who would stand with them instead of just standing for them. So what now? Tommy asked, his cough finally starting to ease in the warmth of Morrison's heavy coat. That looked at the 8 young faces surrounding him, no longer seeing helpless orphans, but a family that had chosen each other through hardship and loss. They reminded him that families weren't just born, they were built one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time. Now we go home, he said simply. We fix the door, patch the bullet holes, and make that house big enough for all of us. But what about Wickham? Marcus asked. What about the law? Morrison was the last of Wickham's enforcers, Ruby May said, checking the papers. They'd found in the dead man's saddlebags, and according to these documents, Wickham's been operating without proper territorial authority for months. His legal papers aren't worth the ink. They're printed on as they mounted up for the ride back. To the farm, little Daisy climbed onto Thod's horse and settled against his chest like she belonged there for the first time in 2 years. Thod felt the weight of grief lifting from his shoulders, replaced by something he thought was lost forever. Hope. The storm was finally breaking as they rode toward home. Sunlight streaming through the clouds like a promise. Behind them lay the bodies of men who tried to profit from children's pain. Ahead lay a farmhouse that would need new windows, a patched roof, and probably a bigger kitchen table, but most importantly it would need what it had been missing for too long: the sound of children's laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent too long as they crested the hill overlooking his property. Thod thought he could almost see Margaret standing on the porch, smiling at the sight of their house, full of life again. Samuel and Joshua would have loved having so many brothers and sisters to play with. Welcome home, he said quietly, and 8 voices answered back in perfect harmony. Thank you, Papa. Thad, if you enjoyed this story of courage, family, and second chances, hit that subscribe button, because every story we tell carries the same message. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from the most broken places. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video.